Hello and welcome to CWA Media. My name is Niall Mulholland from the CWA, and I'm joined today by Tony Saunois, the Secretary of the Committee for Workers International. And of course what we're discussing is the issue that's dominating world headlines at the moment, the war in Ukraine, and we'd have all seen the terrible scenes of bombings, of shellings of cities, of the millions of refugees streaming out of the country at the present time. And of course, it's the working class, it's the poor who will in the main pay the price for this terrible conflict which has taken place. And we in the CWA oppose the Russian invasion, oppose the Putin regime, as we have always done from the start. And at the same time, we cannot have any faith in NATO, which over the last 30 years has expanded eastwards, and now we see the bitter fruits of that process with this terrible eruption of conflict in Ukraine. But I think before I turn to Tony, it's just worth recapping what's taken place at the present time. The situation on the ground is obviously very volatile in Ukraine. Putin, it seems, has clearly miscalculated militarily. He expected a relatively easy passage to Kiev. That has not happened. He probably underestimated the billions worth of arms that has been sent by NATO powers into Ukraine, along with NATO training of Ukraine troops over the last year, which has been effective up to a certain degree against the Russian forces. It might also be the case that Putin thought, with the West humiliated after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that they would be prepared to make compromises whilst he amassed huge forces on the border with Ukraine. That didn't happen. Biden in particular has took a hard line. No talks were engaged over the Christmas period, and Putin then sent his troops in. That might have represented a miscalculation by the West. Despite the rhetoric, perhaps they didn't expect Putin to have an all-out invasion. But whatever the case, it's obviously the working class and the poor people of Ukraine in the main who are suffering because of this terrible war. And we're now faced with a massive amount of propaganda and misinformation from both sides. It's very hard to tell exactly what's happening on the ground, but it does seem to be that Putin is trying to encircle Kiev, as well as taking parts of the east of the country around the Donbass, down to the southeast, and perhaps trying to capture Odessa as well. He may have designs in taking the whole of Ukraine. That would be an enormous undertaking. It would not be tenable. He could not hold down the whole of the country. To take Kiev would be a terrible loss of lives, huge bloodshed, and even just to hold the areas of the south, east, and the east of the country probably will mean the partition of Ukraine and, of course, an ongoing conflict, guerrilla-type struggles taking place for a long period of time. Unless the working class, as we'll come on to, can intervene into the general situation and put its stamp on events. But that's generally speaking what we seem to be seeing unfolding in front of us at the moment inside Ukraine. But of course there are people who say this could get worse, that this conflict could widen. It could involve other countries, and there are real dangers inherent in the situation. We saw over the last week where Poland, the government, was raising the question of giving fighter jets to the Ukraine army, and in response, Moscow said they would treat that as an act of war. That could potentially spiral into a conflict between a NATO country, Poland, and Russia. The Americans pulled back on that issue, and it's led to some tensions between Poland and some of the NATO countries. So that shows some of the possibilities, the dangers inherent in this situation. And it's led many people, particularly younger people, to be understandably fearful of this conflict spreading into a wider European conflict, and even talk of World War III. And that hasn't been on the agenda, the talk of nuclear arms and nuclear attacks for decades in Europe. So what is the prospect for that? Are we facing the real danger of a World War III? We're certainly facing militarization of Europe. We see a massive arms rearmament taken place by Germany and other countries? What is the role of China in this situation? All these issues, I think, need to be looked at in the current context. So I'll ask Tony if he wants to come in at this point on some of these wider issues of can the war get wider, and what are the prospects for relations between the world powers?
Well, thanks, Niall. Well, I think there's many issues posed in this horrific crisis that we see unfolding at the present time, as you've already very well indicated and outlined. And of course, there is a fear amongst a big layer of the youth that we are standing on the brink of World War III. We certainly see a humanitarian catastrophe, the likes of which has not been seen in Europe, certainly since the 1990s and the Balkans conflict. But really, I think before coming to some of the specifics of the prospects of this clash developing further, we have to put it into its context of what's taken place. We see Putin taking this desperate act of an horrific intervention into the Ukraine, but really that underlines something, and it underlines the nature of the period that we're now in. If you go back and we trace what has happened over the last historic period, we've been through the financial crash of 2007-2008. You had so-called 10 years of very slow economic growth, provoking massive polarization and political anger. That then was followed by the onset of the pandemic and the worst economic situation that has arisen in global capitalism for a whole generation. And now, of course, we've come from what appeared to be, in some countries at least, the end game as far as the pandemic is concerned, and you're plunged straight into this horrific war in the Ukraine, followed by Russian intervention. And really that illustrates the nature of the period that we're in. We're in such a period of turmoil and upheaval of global capitalism that we're seeing a reconfiguration of the whole world situation, of world relations, and the position between the different states and the powers as well. Really, we could say we're now in an era of permanent crisis as far as capitalism is concerned. It's going to stumble from one conflict to another, one economic catastrophe to another, probably with some period of a certain upswing or growth, ephemeral growth, and then we're confronted with the consequences of this position that is now currently unfolding. Now, it's terrified sections of the population. There's no question about that. And it is possible with any war. You can't have it's not a prescriptive measure how any war unfolds. Putin, as you said, now quite rightly, thought he was going to go for a very quick victory. He's now got bogged down. You couldn't exclude that you could get some sort of skirmishes and exchange take place. But at the same time, we have to look at the global class interests. US ruling class, Biden in particular, European ruling classes are terrified of the situation spiraling out of control. And any development of a major conflict between the NATO forces and Russia, with the threat that could potentially go nuclear, of course, will be there. They're in the position of holding back from that, from events going that far. They're desperate to try and get some sort of agreement at this stage. Why is that the case? Because a conflagration of that character would jeopardize the very interests of capitalism. It would jeopardize Putin's interests and the interests of the oligarchs, etc. And they're going to take every measure, I think, to try and hold back from that. That does not preclude the fact you couldn't have skirmishes and maybe some clashes develop. But this has plunged the whole world into an entirely new global situation. Now, in this situation, I think we have to say that while the conflict is dragging on, it's gone on longer than what Putin certainly hoped for and anticipated. But nevertheless, you couldn't rule out they're going to now try and secure agreement. As you rightly said, Niall, the Russians have made advances in the east and the south. They're trying to establish a bridge and a corridor. It's not fully determined yet, but you couldn't rule out that the fact that they will try for some sort of agreement at the top to try and avert the crisis developing further. The question is what that will mean in practice on the ground. Of course, is another issue. It would mean a certain dismemberment and a reconfiguration of the Ukraine, and the implications of that for the world economy and what we're seeing now, the implications of that for geopolitical relations are fundamental, and it's going to point to the opening up of an entirely new era, as it already has done. And what is crucial in this position, which unfortunately we're not seeing from the official left, is a need for an independent position to be adopted by the working class to defend its class interests, the interests of the Ukrainian workers, the interests of the Russian workers, the interests of the workers of the world, and the masses who are suffering horrifically from this global crisis of capitalism. So there's many aspects, I think, now we have to develop and explore further, both for Russia and for the global implications of this conflict.
I think that's correct, Tony. And the talks, they're on and off at the present time. There's a number of players involved: Turkey, Israel, some other countries as well, which don't exactly have very good records themselves on invasions and human rights and so on. But they're involved in the talks process at the present time. It might be the case that Putin wants to create as many facts on the ground as possible before he has to cut his losses and settle, most likely, for the Russian-speaking south and east areas of the country. And if he can secure most of the south of Ukraine, then he has vital trading areas and access to the sea and so on. But of course, there'll be whenever it ends, this terrible conflict, it'll be a messy ending, and the working class will still pay the price, because there'll be some level of conflict. There'll be whenever it ends, it'll be the balkanization, it'll be a mess of Ukraine continuing for a long period of time. It's even been reported by off-the-record people in the Pentagon that they wouldn't mind seeing Russia being involved in another Afghanistan. In other words, a long-running conflict which bogs them down, costs a huge amount in funds and in their war chest and in human life, and that would be a major problem for Russia. As I said, of course, it's people in the region who pay for all these machinations of the main powers. But just to maybe look at another important angle of this conflict at the present time, and that's on the economy, on the global economy. We see already that the energy prices, which are already going up as we come out of COVID, are now spiking because of the war. We see a big rise in inflation. That's had a knock-on effect on foodstuffs, on the cost of wheat, because, of course, Ukraine is an important producer of wheat and other cereals. That can have a big impact on everybody, on the cost of going shopping, but also, in particular, for people in the poorer parts of the world, in Latin America, in Asia, and Africa, and also the Middle East. And we should remember the repercussions a big hike in prices can have. In 2011, one of the main reasons for the spark in what became known as the Arab Spring was the big rise in prices at the time, along with mass unemployment. There's also the problems that Russian working class people are now facing because of the sanctions. The possibility of a debt default by Russia has been raised. Already the ruble has fallen in worth, and that's costing people a lot at the till. On the other hand, do sanctions actually get rid of regimes? It's not been the case with Saddam Hussein and others. It tends to be the population that pays the price for that. And then on the other hand, we've got this position now where America, because they're feeling the pinch of energy costs, are turning towards the old enemies like Venezuela and seeing if they can cut new deals with them. They're also courting Saudi Arabia, despite that regime having a lot of blood in its hands as well. So maybe in just some of these broader issues, Tony, you could come in on the question of this war and the world economy.
Well, I think it's crucial because it's already having a devastating effect, because you had the propaganda from the West that they'd overcome the COVID crisis, that the economy was picking up and was going into a new period of growth. Now, there was a certain upturn, having gone to such a catastrophic fall, at least in the imperialist countries. There was a certain upturn or relative bounce back was beginning to take place. What that meant for the mass of the working class was another question in many countries. Unemployment was brought down in many countries, etc. But even prior to the intervention of the Russians into the Ukraine, that was slowing down. You had the fact that the Chinese were giving their lowest growth forecast for 30 years. You had a slowdown beginning to take place in the US economy. The growth was not being sustained to the same level. And you had globally this development of inflation taking place, the rising food prices. Now, what has happened now with the intervention into the Ukraine has exacerbated all of those problems tremendously. In fact, we could say this Ukrainian intervention has had one important feature reflected in it. We commented at the time that COVID acted as the great accelerator. It was a great accelerator of all the divisions in society. It was a great accelerator in terms of the geopolitical relations, the clash between a declining US imperialism and a rising China, the great accelerator in terms of the gap between rich and poor. This crisis aroused in Ukraine has really crystallized all of those elements to an even greater extent. You see the choking off is taking place of any growth in the economy in many countries at this stage. There is a major problem. I mean, the incredible, the gas and oil crisis is one aspect which is fundamental. It's going to have profound effects. Inflation in America already up officially at 8%, likely to hit 10% here in the UK in the course of the next period. And this is going to feed through. We already see the effects of the crisis with manufacturers ceasing production of cars, of some companies in Europe, and of course in the Ukraine, and indeed in Russia itself. Yeah, and you have now the prospect of stagflation taking place and gripping a number of key countries. And as you rightly say, Niall, we have featured in the CWA the issue of the debt crisis, this global debt crisis, which is phenomenal. Well, that's taken another twist now. You have the prospect, as you rightly said now, of a Russian default, which could trigger a bigger problem as far as the global financial system itself is concerned. And a critical element as a consequence of this war is another issue, which is going to be horrific in terms of the consequences that it's going to have, particularly for the peoples of Asia and Africa, and to a certain extent of Latin America. And that is the threat to global food supply. Russia and the Ukraine account for 30% of world grain production. They make a phenomenal contribution to fertilizing as well. This is going to have an effect of driving up prices of grain and wheat. It's going to trigger a position of more food shortages. You already have in Afghanistan the horrors of that, of 8 million people on the brink of starvation and famine taking place. This is going to be accelerated as a consequence of this particular crisis which is now unfolding. All of the features in the world economy, and that's going to hit as well in Europe and in America in terms of the attacks on living standards that will take place flowing from that. And not least, we have to say that Putin, despite what he is claiming, is riding on support, probably the majority of the population at this stage in Russia, although some very heroic protests are taking place. The opposition to the war is quite substantial there, but the Russian working class are also going to pay a terrible price for this adventurous intervention by Putin into the Ukraine in the course of the next period, and it's resulted in cracks in the Russian regime. The very significant apparent reports of the house arrest of the head of the foreign service of the FSB, the secret services, Sergei Beseda, and his deputy, probably for giving Putin duff information about what the real situation was in the Ukraine, is a measure of what can start fragmented and breaking, and the cracks that can start opening up within the Putin regime. But these are going to have massive consequences. And what we'd say, the horrors of this war, and it is horrors that we're seeing at this stage, of the Russian forces really using the tactics they used in Syria, of a repetition of what they did in the city of Aleppo, of reducing it to rubble. It's a catastrophe for the peoples of the Ukraine, and indeed for the Russian peoples as well. But from this, the other factors together, well, we have to go through this bloodbath at the moment of witnessing this, the tragedies that we're seeing in this situation. As with all wars, this will also open the road for social explosion. It can open the road for social explosions and the resurgence of the class struggle as the war draws to a conclusion, as the consequences of it are felt through the deaths and the economic position which enshrines. And the key question here is building the forces for the working class to offer a real alternative to the system of capitalism, which is the product, given the product of this horrific conflict which is taking place.
Thank you, Tony. I think at this point I'd just like to encourage everybody to sign up to our CWA Media YouTube channel. Please go on to YouTube and subscribe to CWA Media. Just on the point you were making there, Tony, about the view of this war in Latin America, Asia, and Africa and other parts of the world, it must be coloured to some degree by some of the regimes in those continents. For example, Pakistan, India, China have not come out resolutely against this war in the sense of the Western governments. The role of China, which is described as pro-Russian neutral in this process. On the one hand, they've got close ties to Russia. They're stepping up the economic links, which Putin needs to try and offset the sanctions. The United States accused China of giving military aid to Russia. That was dismissed by China, but perhaps that's something that could come down the line. We saw a spat between Imran Khan, the leader in Pakistan and the West, over the position he's taken. And of course, amongst the masses of many of these countries, this conflict can be viewed a bit differently than perhaps it is in Western and Northern Europe. After all, they will have a much closer to hand the experiences of the Iraq War, of the Afghanistan War, of the question of the oppression of the Palestinians, and the continuing terrible war in Yemen, which has led to many deaths, tens of thousands of deaths, and millions of people facing the prospect of famine. So in those parts of the world, obviously, this can be viewed somewhat different, and that spills over to the question of refugees. We see there that over 2 million people have had to flee Ukraine over the last 2 weeks. It's a desperate situation of human suffering. That's going to get worse. It's estimated that the next waves coming through will be those of less resources, less income, don't have family to go to in other parts of Europe, so they'll be stranded in the countries in which they arrive. There could be all sorts of tensions develop in such a situation. We have the spectacle in Britain where the Conservative government of Boris Johnson is taking this hard line where they're not opening up the doors to the refugees as has happened in some of the EU countries. And instead, as even one Tory minister said, they're trying to privatise the situation by asking people locally to open up their doors and to bring in Ukraine refugees, but without the proper state backing and support in that situation. We've also, of course, had the reports of racism on the border with Poland and Romania and other countries which are faced by minorities trying to flee the conflict in Ukraine. So there's lots of these wider issues which have, involved in the whole process of this tide of human misery, and also how it's seen across the world. So maybe you want to comment on some of those points, Tony.
Yeah, well, I think you touched upon a very important point there, Niall, because the central point we also have to see with the horrors of what Putin has conducted is the astounding hypocrisy of Western capitalism and Western imperialism in particular. And that has not been lost on millions around the world, but particularly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I mean, everything that they are denouncing Putin for doing, and he's committing horrific murderous crimes, there's no question whatsoever about that, but they are also guilty of that. Did not the Iraqi people suffer as much as what the Ukrainian people are suffering at this particular point in time? Have not the peoples of Afghanistan suffered under the brutality of US, British and other NATO forces, bombs raining down on them over the course of the past period, prior to the withdrawal. The hypocrisy is outstanding. It's incredible, the position. Even what they're saying now about the chemical weapons, well, they've used chemical weapons in the past as well in different conflicts. And that has not been lost on some of the youth in particular, but some of the masses in Asia and Africa, Latin America. And there's a certain legacy of the past there. There's a feeling amongst some as well, in some of these countries, a sort of hankering back to the old days of the Soviet Union. In South Africa, Alea, who would look back to the Soviet Union and would see it as supporting them in their armed struggle against the apartheid regime. And that's echoed elsewhere as well. And it's reflected, for example, in Latin America, where Morales, who's compromised with capitalism in the past, but made a devastating attack on the hypocrisy of the West, reminding them that while they denounced the Russians for what they are doing, did they not drop the nuclear bombs and the atomic bombs on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And what was the consequences of that? What have they done historically in their interventions in the Middle East and elsewhere? And that has lent to a certain pro-Russian sympathy existing in some of these countries. It's been echoed by some of the leaders of these countries, autocrats, and people who are not progressive in any way. I mean, you mentioned Imran Khan in Pakistan, who's conducted a vicious program of privatization, has been compromised with the Pakistani military. But, in response to the attacks of US imperialism, was compelled to thunder back, "We are not your slaves." And it's it's a measure of the polarization which is opening up, and there is a trend here taking place. And this is a central point. Many of these issues are not now determined in terms of how the geopolitical and the world relations will fully develop in the course of the next period. But there is a drift, a tendency present in this position on the one side, the US of Europe forming this bloc against Russia, as they're boasting about it. They've strengthened how NATO at this stage is perceived. They appear to have presented this face of unity of the Western powers. As Biden boasts, America is back. The free world is coming together, as they put it. And as one of Benjamin Rhodes, the former national security advisor to Obama's White House, put it, the post 9/11 war on terror period of American hubris and decline is now behind us, is what he boasted. Mm-hmm. Looking to the future, though, he continued, and we're not sure what's next. It's not really a declaration of confidence of where they're going, but they're presenting this farce, and they have partly pulled together. But on the other side, let us not exaggerate that. They partly pulled together, they say they strengthen their position, but that has not resolved any of the underlying tensions and conflicts that exist between the West. It has not arrested the decline of US imperialism. They think they're back. They or they hope they're back, rather, to the position of the old world order of American rule as the major power. What this crisis has demonstrated is the limitations of the power of Western imperialism and US imperialism. And the old conflicts are going to develop. And there's new conflicts penned. I mean, you mentioned, Niall, the militarization that's taken place, the phenomenal change in Germany, the flip in its arms position, which, by the way, a section of the German ruling class have been pushing for quite a long period of time, the massive increase in the military budget, the fact that they're going to now be the largest military power in Europe, the third power internationally. It's opening up a whole new position as far as world relations are concerned, and divisions between them will come back to the surface. That was reflected of what's happened in Poland and the spat between Poland and the US over the sending of the MiG planes to the Ukraine. Now, on the other side, you see the apparent emergence of another bloc headed by China, drawing together in South Asia. You have India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all indirectly, in reality, leaning towards leaning towards backing Russia. And you see a trend in that direction. Of course, China is a crucial player in this process as well. And the move towards a partial alliance with Russia prior to this crisis, and they're trying to sustain that to some degree, but they are checked because the Chinese are playing a very careful balancing act at this stage. On the one side, tilting towards Russia, but also being extremely cautious because they fear of the consequences that may flow from that particular process of damaging their interests. Now, one of the issues that has arisen is the sanctions against Russia, which have come forward. The Chinese are now extremely worried that they could be caught up with that, and the US is already beginning to threaten sanctions against China if they continue and give financial aid and possibly military aid to Russia as well. Now that leaves the Chinese in an extremely difficult position. They want to challenge both Russia and China, want to challenge the position of US imperialism, but at the same time, China in particular wants to try and defend its interests, but it's leading towards this tendency that is there towards two and possibly three type of blocks emerging in this new world relations. How long these alliances last is another question. Xi and the Chinese regime can come quite close to Russia. They can give a certain financial support, which can mitigate a little bit against the effect of the Western sanctions. How long that lasts as other issues and arise is an entirely different question. But there's repercussions going to be felt elsewhere, and you can see how utterly unprincipled these the representatives of capitalism are. For decades now, the US imperialism has been trying to overthrow, including through attempted coups, the Chavez and the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Now, we have had strong criticisms of the Maduro regime, but look at the change in the position. Needs must. So they run into a problem with oil supply from Russia because of the consequences, and with a drop of a finger and a drop of a hat, Biden immediately opens up cordial relations with Maduro to try and look for an alternative source of oil supply. And by the way, now you can see how unstable the situation. That was yesterday's news. Today's news is now, because of the backlash in the US from the right on that question, he's had to backtrack in terms of that particular development. But the hypocrisy of them, they talk about the dictatorship, and it is a dictatorship in Russia. Look at Johnson, of what he's doing now, looking for an alternative source of oil, scuffles off to Saudi Arabia, looking, a vicious regime. No comment in relation to the 81 executions that took place in one day in Saudi Arabia, and just in a desperate attempt to search for oil supply. The stench of hypocrisy flowing from the representatives of global capital at this stage knows no bounds. Now, this is going to have other repercussions in terms of the position. Even within Europe, we have the position with Germany. We also have what has taken place with Sweden and Finland, who previously maintained a neutral position. You couldn't exclude now their move towards being incorporated into NATO. So we have an entirely new reconfiguration taking place in terms of the global and the world situation, which this crisis epitomizes and crystallizes and brings to the fore. Exactly how it's going to pan out in the short to medium term is unclear. But throughout all of this, they are paving the way for a massive backlash and upheavals by the working class and the poor in a whole series of countries, including in Russia, including in Europe, and particularly we're going to see probably in the shorter term big movements in the neo-colonial world because of the desperate position is going to arise from the economic position and because of the food shortages which exist, and the need for an alternative of a socialist character, of a class character, is now more urgent than ever of a task that faces the working class to offer an alternative to this horrific nightmare which is open up, of Dante's Seven Rings of Hell, which is now unfolding on the basis of the continuation of capitalism. And the need for a socialist alternative to be presented is now of critical importance.
Well, I think that's very important, Tony, that we end on that note on the question of what can the workers' movement do? What can socialists do? What can the working class do in this terrible situation? And first and foremost, socialists must give solidarity and support to the beleaguered people of Ukraine. That's all parts of Ukraine, the west, the centre, and also the east, the Donbass region, which has had conflict since 2014, leading to over 14,000 people killed in that part of the country. We have to support the right of people to defend themselves, of course, under attack. We would propose that that is best done in a cross-community, democratically organised fashion, and is linked up to a programme for social and economic change. And in that way, an appeal can be made, a class appeal, can be made to the Russian conscripts. And there are reports that there's demoralisation amongst some of them. And that appeal can be made and sections can be won over. And of course, we'd support completely the brave attempts by people in Russia to protest against this war as well and send solidarity to them. I think also we can see that the international war movement can grow on the basis of this conflict becoming bogged down over the next number of weeks and months. And there will be an element of what we saw in the 1980s, I think, where there was mass protests by CND and other organisations against the threat of nuclear war. That's come back on the agenda as well because of the stakes that have been raised in this conflict. So those are all the ways we can work in the next period of time to help in our way to end this terrible conflict by supporting the international efforts of the working class to cut across this terrible war. So we'll end this broadcast now. We will come back, of course, to this issue again. There'll be different aspects of it which we will discuss on CWI Media. But once again, I just encourage all our viewers to go online, to subscribe to our YouTube channel, to follow our website, socialistworld.net, where we have regular updated articles and analysis of what's taken place in Ukraine and the region and on other international issues. And if you agree with the ideas we've outlined today and our broad analysis, I would appeal to you to contact the Committee for Workers International, to join us in the struggle to change society, to end wars. And the way to end wars like this is to end the system that spawns them. That's the system of profit-making, the system of capitalism, and removing that system that has long outgrown its usefulness, as we can see by today's situation, and instead let's usher in a democratic, socialist society for the needs of all, rather than for tiny elites, oligarchs, billionaires, and their political representatives. So on that note, we wish you all the best and welcome you to the next broadcast where we'll be discussing these and other pressing issues of the day. Thank you.